The courtroom smelled like old wood and desperation. Judge Patricia Hernandez had seen thousands of custody cases in her 15 years on the bench, but nothing quite like this. The oppressive weight of the Mitchell case hung in the air like a storm that hadn't yet broken. She could feel it radiating from every corner of the room, from the lawyers shuffling their papers with aggressive precision, from the bailiff standing with his arms crossed, from the gallery packed with spectators who had nothing better to do than watch a family destroy itself in slow motion. The mother sat rigidly at the plaintiff's table, her fingers trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the wooden surface. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and she looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. Dark circles shadowed the hollows beneath her eyes. Her blonde hair, usually immaculate according to the photo in her file from 3 years ago, was pulled back in a tight bun that seemed to pull at her scalp with the same tension that had been pulling at her heart since the day David had walked out. Her lawyer, Thomas Chen, was mid-50s, sharp as a blade, and he'd already made it clear through his opening statements that he was here to demolish the father's credibility entirely. He'd presented a narrative so sympathetic that even the court stenographer had seemed moved. A single mother trying desperately to protect her traumatized daughter from a father who cared more about his own convenience than his child's psychological well-being. Across the courtroom, David Mitchell slouched in the defendant's chair, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack under the pressure. He was handsome in a worn-out kind of way, the kind of man who had probably been charming once, before the weight of custody battles and missed support payments had aged him into something harder, more desperate. His attorney, Rebecca Kaufman, was younger, aggressive, and already visibly frustrated with how the narrative had shifted against her client before the trial had even truly begun. But it was Emma who broke Judge Hernandez's heart. Emma Mitchell sat in the gallery, clutching a stuffed animal against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to earth. She was small for 3 years old, delicate in a way that made her seem even more fragile against the imposing architecture of the courtroom. Her mother's green eyes stared out from her face with an expression that no child should ever have to wear, a kind of exhausted watchfulness that belonged on a soldier's face, not a toddler's. The stuffed animal was a dog. That detail would matter more than anyone in this room could possibly know. The case file was 3 inches thick. Judge Hernandez had read it twice, flagging the documents that seemed most significant. Sarah had been meticulous in her documentation, almost obsessively so. She kept a journal with dated entries describing Emma's anxiety spirals, the way the girl's breathing would become shallow when David was due to pick her up, the way she'd cling to her mother with an intensity that seemed to drain the life force from both of them. Photographs were included. Emma with red-rimmed eyes after a weekend with her father. Emma curled up on her mother's bed, wrapped in blankets, refusing to go to school because Daddy might forget to pick me up again. Medical records from Dr. Patricia Gonzalez, Emma's pediatrician, noting stress-related regression. The child was having accidents again despite being nearly potty-trained, was exhibiting signs of separation anxiety that went beyond normal developmental stages, and had mentioned nightmares so frequently that the doctor had recommended psychological evaluation. Video recordings had been submitted as evidence. Judge Hernandez had watched them in the privacy of her chambers, each one more heartbreaking than the last. One showed Emma having what appeared to be a panic attack when her mother mentioned an upcoming visitation with her father. Another captured the child asking repeatedly, in a voice so small it was almost inaudible, "Does Daddy still love me? Is he coming back? Will he remember me this time?" The implication was clear from Sarah's careful presentation. David was an absent, unreliable father, a man who had checked out emotionally, a man whose love for his daughter was conditional, dependent on convenience, subject to cancellation whenever work called or something better came along. Now, sitting in the witness box, Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the edges. Her voice cracked as she spoke, and Judge Hernandez recognized that she wasn't performing for the courtroom. This was genuine devastation. "My daughter can't sleep," Sarah testified, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "She has panic attacks. She asks me every single morning if Daddy still loves her because he keeps canceling visits. He promised her he would take her to the park last month and he didn't show up. He didn't even call. She stood by the window for 3 hours, dressed in her favorite outfit, waiting. How is that in her best interest? How is exposing her to that kind of rejection and abandonment the right choice for a 3-year-old?" The courtroom was silent. Even the opposing counsel seemed momentarily at a loss. Then David's attorney, Rebecca Kaufman, stood up for cross-examination, and the tenor shifted entirely. "Ms. Mitchell," she began, her tone suggesting she was about to deconstruct everything Sarah had just said, "you've presented a very compelling narrative here. But I need to ask you directly, in your efforts to document your daughter's distress during visits with her father, have you considered that some of this anxiety might be iatrogenic? That is, caused by your own anxious attachment and your consistent messaging that her father is unreliable." Sarah's face flushed. "I would never." "You wouldn't intentionally," Kaufman continued smoothly. "But unconsciously, children are mirrors. They reflect the emotional states of their primary caregivers. Your daughter sees that you're anxious about her father. She internalizes that anxiety, and then you document it as evidence of his inadequacy. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy." The judge watched the exchange carefully. This was the dangerous part of custody cases, the way they could become battlegrounds where the child became collateral damage in a war between two adults who both genuinely believed they were protecting her. "Mr. Mitchell works long hours as a construction manager," Kaufman explained to the court. "Yes, he's missed some pickups, but that's the reality of working in his industry. The real problem here," she gestured toward Sarah, "is a mother trying to weaponize a child against her father. A mother who has had primary custody for 18 months and who has used that access to shape the child's perception of the father in ways that are damaging." David stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable, but his hands were clenched into fists. The tension in the courtroom became suffocating. Judge Hernandez listened to both sides argue passionately about what was best for Emma. She heard about David's construction contracts, about Sarah's anxiety disorder, which Kaufman weaponized brilliantly, about the father's love despite his limitations, about the mother's need for control despite her good intentions. But what the judge kept returning to, what kept nagging at her even as the arguments continued, was that small girl in the gallery, clutching a stuffed dog and staring at nothing with eyes that had already learned too much about disappointment. The judge had been doing this work for 15 years. She'd ordered thousands of custody arrangements. She'd made decisions that shaped entire childhoods, but she prided herself on something most judges didn't: the willingness to admit when standard procedures weren't enough. And something about this case, the raw pain radiating from both parents, each of them absolutely convinced they were the one actually protecting Emma, the visible distress on the child's small face, told her this was different. This was a case that required more than custody schedules and child support calculations. This was a case where the usual tools would fail. As the arguments concluded and attorneys began preparing their closing statements, Judge Hernandez made a decision that would shock everyone in the courtroom and set in motion a chain of events no one could have anticipated. She leaned forward and called for order. "We're going to take a brief recess," the judge announced, her voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested this was not a suggestion. "I want to bring in Dr. Marcus Webb and his service K-9, Luna." The courtroom erupted in confused whispers and objections. Sarah's lawyer looked baffled, as if the judge had suddenly announced she was consulting a tarot card reader. David's attorney stood up immediately to object, citing relevant case law about expert witnesses and proper procedures. But Judge Hernandez simply dismissed them all with a wave of her hand. She had already made up her mind, and no one, not even the parents, not even the attorneys with their years of experience, had any idea what was about to unfold or why a small girl's answer to a dog would matter more than any testimony either parent could ever give. Dr. Marcus Webb was not a typical courtroom expert. He existed in a space that most legal professionals found difficult to categorize. He wasn't a forensic psychologist in the traditional sense. He didn't rely on standardized tests or diagnostic manuals, though he certainly understood those tools. He wasn't a social worker, though he worked with vulnerable populations. He wasn't a veterinarian, though he understood canine neurobiology at a level that most PhD researchers would envy. Instead, Marcus occupied a unique intersection of trauma psychology, animal behavior science, and what could only be described as an almost preternatural ability to read the spaces between what people said and what they actually felt. For the past 12 years, he had been studying the neurological effects of canine-assisted therapy on children experiencing severe anxiety, emotional dysregulation, and trauma. His research had been published in peer-reviewed journals that most courtroom observers had never heard of, journals like the Journal of Trauma and Dissociation, the International Journal of Companion Animal Medicine, and Child Development Quarterly. His TED Talk, delivered at a conference in Austin 3 years ago, had gone viral in certain circles, accumulating over 2 million views among mental health professionals, social workers, and parents desperately seeking alternative approaches to childhood trauma. But his credentials, as impressive as they were, weren't really what made him exceptional. What made Marcus exceptional was something that transcended credentials entirely. It was his partner, Luna, a 3-year-old golden retriever with the kind of presence that seemed to alter the emotional temperature of any room she entered. Luna was certified as both an emotional support animal and a trauma response K-9, which meant she'd been trained to recognize the physiological signs of panic attacks, anxiety spirals, and dissociative episodes. She'd walked into operating rooms where pediatric surgeons needed calm in the room before they could operate on frightened children. She'd been present in ICUs where dying patients needed something warm and alive to hold on to. She'd even walked crime scenes, her presence somehow transforming spaces of violence into spaces where healing might be possible. But more important than any of her training was something simpler. Luna knew how to hold space. When Marcus entered the courtroom with Luna on a soft blue leash, everything changed. The atmospheric pressure seemed to shift. The artificial lighting seemed to soften. Even the sound of people breathing seemed to quiet, as if everyone collectively recognized that something fundamentally different was happening now. Emma's eyes went wide. Her small body, which had been rigid with tension throughout the entire morning, seemed to physically relax. She sat forward slightly, her stuffed dog forgotten for the first time, her entire attention focused on the large golden dog padding calmly beside the tall man with the gentle eyes. Marcus was 6 feet 2 inches tall, with the kind of calm presence that came from having processed his own trauma thoroughly. His dark hair was starting to gray at the temples. His eyes were the color of moss, green-brown and observant in a way that made people instinctively lower their voices around him. He wore a simple blazer over a button-down shirt, nothing flashy or performative, nothing designed to impress or intimidate. His whole being seemed calibrated toward one purpose: creating safety. Luna, by contrast, was pure elegance and gentle strength. Her coat was the color of honey in sunlight. Her eyes were intelligent and kind. She moved with the kind of grace that suggested she understood the weight of her own power and had chosen, long ago, to use it only in service of others. She didn't pull on her leash. She didn't sniff or mark territory or do anything dogs typically do. She simply walked beside Marcus with the kind of focus and presence that suggested this moment mattered. Judge Hernandez gestured for Marcus to approach the bench. The two exchanged quiet words that the court reporter struggled to capture accurately. Marcus nodded slowly, and something in his expression, a slight tightness around the eyes, a barely perceptible compression of his lips, suggested he understood exactly what she was asking him to do and the magnitude of the responsibility it entailed. He turned to face Emma, and in that moment the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Everything else, the lawyers, the legal arguments, the custody schedules, the assessments about financial responsibility, fell away. What remained was a man, a dog, and a child whose suffering had somehow cracked through all the legal formality and forced the system to acknowledge that standard procedures weren't enough. "Emma," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying easily through the courtroom without needing to raise his volume. He was kneeling down to her level but not moving toward her, a crucial distinction. He was making himself smaller, less threatening, but he was giving her space to choose whether to engage. "This is Luna. She's very good at listening. Do you want to say hello?" Emma's grip tightened on her stuffed animal. She didn't move. Her mother leaned forward, desperate hope flickering across her face like a candle in wind. Hope that maybe, finally, someone had found a way to reach her daughter, to access the truth that seemed locked away somewhere Emma couldn't consciously articulate. Her father stared at the floor, his leg bouncing with the kind of nervous energy that came from watching your parenting judged and found wanting. He had no idea what was about to happen. He had no framework for understanding how a dog could possibly matter in a custody hearing. All he knew was that his ex-wife's lawyer was watching him with barely concealed satisfaction, as if this latest development confirmed everything they'd been arguing all along. "Luna doesn't need you to say anything if you don't want to," Marcus continued, his voice steady as a heartbeat, soothing in a way that seemed designed specifically for a terrified child. "But she likes to sit with people who have big feelings. Do you have big feelings today?" The question was asked so gently, with such profound acceptance of whatever answer came, that it seemed to unlock something in Emma. Her small body trembled. Her lower lip protruded slightly, the way it did when she was about to cry. She nodded barely, but enough. A tiny, almost imperceptible acknowledgement that yes, she had big feelings, and yes, maybe it would be okay to let them out in front of a dog who understood. What happened next made everyone in the courtroom hold their breath. Even the court reporter's fingers froze above the keyboard. The bailiff leaned forward slightly. Sarah's lawyer stopped mid-gesture. David's attorney straightened, suddenly aware that something significant was occurring. Because when Emma finally spoke, she didn't speak to her parents. She didn't speak to the judge or the lawyers or the bailiff or anyone else who represented the apparatus of authority that had been terrifying her all morning. She spoke only to the dog, and the words that came out of her small mouth, directed entirely at Luna, as if Luna were the only being in the world who could possibly understand, would change everything anyone in that courtroom thought they understood about this case. Emma's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the courtroom, it carried with the weight of truth finally being allowed to exist. "My tummy hurts when Daddy doesn't call," Emma whispered to Luna, her tiny fingers reaching out tentatively to touch the dog's golden fur. The room became perfectly still. What made Marcus Webb different from other expert witnesses wasn't just his knowledge or his credentials. It was his understanding of a fundamental truth that most of the legal system had yet to fully grasp. Children don't lie to dogs. They can't maintain false narratives in the presence of an animal that responds to authentic emotional states rather than to the words themselves. When a child speaks to a dog, her cortisol levels drop. The amygdala, the brain's fear center, quiets. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and logical thought, remains engaged. What emerges is something close to pure truth, unfiltered by the social anxiety or fear of judgment that might otherwise constrain a child's words. Emma, in that moment, was as honest as she had ever been in her short life. And everyone in that courtroom, from the judge to the attorneys to the spectators in the gallery, understood that they were witnessing something rare and significant. They were witnessing a child finally finding her voice, not because she'd been coaxed or prompted, but because Luna's presence had created a safety that nothing else could replicate. "My tummy hurts when Daddy doesn't call," Emma whispered to Luna, her tiny fingers reaching out to touch the dog's golden fur with the kind of reverence usually reserved for something sacred. The courtroom was completely silent, the kind of silence that felt physical, as if everyone had stopped breathing simultaneously. Even the court reporter seemed to be barely breathing, her fingers hovering above the keyboard, capturing every word with the understanding that what was being spoken now was different from everything that had come before. Sarah Mitchell's hand flew to her mouth. A sound escaped her, not quite a gasp, not quite a sob, something in between that contained the weight of 1,000 maternal guilts suddenly crystallizing into a single moment of comprehension. Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't the tears of vindication she might have expected. They were tears of something far more complicated: grief, guilt, recognition, and the terrible realization that her daughter had been trying to communicate something essential all along, and everyone had been too focused on the custody battle to truly listen. David's jaw opened slightly, shock rippling across his features like a stone dropped into still water. His attorney, Rebecca Kaufman, reached over to grip his arm, whether in support or restraint. It was difficult to tell. He was staring at his daughter with an expression that suggested he was seeing her for the first time, really seeing her, and understanding simultaneously that he had been failing her in ways he hadn't comprehended until this exact moment. The judge's face remained neutral, but her grip on her gavel tightened almost imperceptibly. Marcus remained perfectly still, giving Emma space, not interrupting, not validating or invalidating what she was saying, simply providing the kind of presence that allowed truth to continue flowing. His eyes were sharp and analytical, observing, nodding, understanding at a level that went far beyond the mere words being spoken. He was watching Emma's body language, her breathing patterns, the way she was touching Luna, the micro-expressions that flitted across her small face. He was a scientist of human suffering, and what he was observing was the real thing: authentic childhood trauma finding its voice. "And when Mommy cries in the kitchen, my tummy hurts too," Emma continued, her words tumbling out now like a dam breaking after months of pressure. She wasn't looking at anyone but Luna. The dog's presence had created a channel for everything bottled inside this child to finally flow. "And when Daddy gets angry at Mommy on the phone, I get scared. Really scared. I think maybe he's angry at me too." David flinched visibly. His attorney whispered something urgently in his ear, but he wasn't really hearing her. He was hearing his daughter describe a version of his behavior that he probably didn't even recognize in himself. The anger that came from feeling unheard, unappreciated, trapped in a custody arrangement that made him feel like a peripheral figure in his own child's life. Emma's voice grew quieter, but somehow more powerful in its quietness. "I don't know why you both fight about me," Emma said, each word seeming to cost her something, as if she were translating feelings into language for the first time. "I love Daddy, and I love Mommy, but when I'm at Daddy's house, Mommy is sad. And when I'm at Mommy's house, Daddy doesn't call, so I can't win." The simplicity of that statement, "so I can't win," seemed to penetrate something in everyone who heard it. It was the kind of truth that cut through all the legal maneuvering, all the strategic positioning, all the careful narrative construction that both parents had been engaging in. A 3-year-old had identified the fundamental problem with their entire approach. They had made their daughter the battleground, and she had understood, with a clarity that was almost unbearable, that there was no way for her to love both her parents without being disloyal to one of them. Sarah began to cry harder, but it was different now. Not the tears of someone being validated, but the tears of someone finally understanding the cost of her own survival strategy. She had been so focused on protecting Emma from David's unreliability that she had failed to see she was asking her daughter to protect her from her own pain. Every time Sarah cried in the kitchen, Emma had internalized that as her responsibility to fix. Every time David canceled a visit, Emma had internalized that as her failure to be good enough, to keep her father's attention. "I don't know why you both fight about me," Emma repeated, as if the statement deserved emphasis. "I love Daddy, and I love Mommy, but when I'm at Daddy's house, Mommy is sad. And when I'm at Mommy's house, Daddy doesn't call, so I can't win." Marcus placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder, a gesture so subtle that most people in the courtroom almost missed it. It was enough to anchor her, to remind her that she wasn't alone in this moment, that there was an adult present who understood the weight of what she was carrying. "Thank you for telling Luna that," Marcus said softly. "That was very brave." But Emma wasn't finished. "Luna understands," Emma said, looking up at Marcus for the first time, her green eyes holding an intensity that seemed impossible in a 3-year-old. "She's sad too sometimes, but she doesn't stop being happy. She just keeps going. Can Mommy and Daddy do that? Can they just be happy even though they're not together?" The question hung in the courtroom like a prayer. It was such a simple thing, really. A child asking if it was possible for her parents to be happy separately, to move forward, to stop using her as the bridge that was supposed to keep them connected. But it was also devastating in its clarity. Emma had somehow intuited what no therapist had been able to communicate, that the real gift her parents could give her was permission to love them both without needing to choose, to reconcile, to fix the fundamental brokenness of their relationship. The courtroom erupted, but not in the way it had during the opening arguments. This was not strategic objection or legal maneuvering. The bailiff actually stood up. Sarah made a sound, a kind of broken sob that seemed to come from the deepest part of her being. David's face crumpled. Judge Hernandez banged her gavel once, commanding order, but even she seemed shaken by what was unfolding. The carefully constructed narratives, the accusations about parental fitness, the character assassinations, the strategic victim playing, all of it shattered in the face of a 3-year-old's articulation of her own pain. "Order," Judge Hernandez commanded again, her voice firm but carrying an undertone of something else. Compassion, perhaps, or recognition. Order in this courtroom. But Emma wasn't finished. She looked directly at her father, her small face impossibly serious, carrying an expression that seemed to have aged her beyond her years. It was as if, by speaking her truth to Luna, she had crossed some threshold into a more adult understanding of her own situation. "I don't want you to choose who loves me best, Daddy," Emma said, her voice steady in a way that contrasted sharply with her earlier trembling. "I want you to show me you both love me the same way you did before the fight." The statement was so direct, so achingly clear in its request, that it seemed to bypass all of David's defenses. His shoulders began to shake. Tears streamed down his face, not the tears of someone being defeated in a custody battle, but the tears of a father suddenly confronted with what his own emotional unavailability had cost his daughter. He stood up, unable to contain the force of his reaction, and for a moment it seemed like he might move toward Emma. His attorney tried to restrain him, but he pulled away. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "Emma, I'm so sorry." Judge Hernandez started to object, to maintain courtroom decorum, but something stopped her. The moment was too significant, too human, too important to interrupt with procedure. But then Emma did something that made everyone in the courtroom freeze. She looked directly at Luna, then slowly turned to look at her father with an expression that seemed impossible for a 3-year-old to hold. A combination of understanding and fear, and something that looked disturbingly like resignation. Marcus leaned down and whispered something in Emma's ear, something only Emma could hear, his voice so quiet that even the court reporter couldn't capture the words. Whatever he said made the little girl's face go absolutely pale. She looked at Luna with an intensity that suggested she was asking the dog for permission or reassurance, then slowly turned back to look at her father. And in that moment, the entire case shifted on its axis. Because what had begun as a straightforward custody dispute was about to reveal itself as something far darker, far more sinister, and far more complex than anyone in that courtroom had imagined. The recess was called immediately. Judge Hernandez's voice cut through the emotional chaos with the precision of a scalpel. "We are taking a 15-minute recess. Bailiff, please ensure that Mr. Mitchell remains in the courtroom. Everyone else, we will reconvene in my chambers shortly." Her tone left no room for argument, but the confusion was palpable. Sarah's lawyer stood up, questions forming on his lips. David's attorney was already pulling documents from her briefcase, preparing for whatever procedural challenge was about to come. The spectators in the gallery began whispering urgently, some pulling out their phones to text about what they'd just witnessed. But Judge Hernandez's attention was fixed on Marcus. She gestured for him to approach the bench, and Luna followed, her presence somehow calming the roiling tension in the room. The judge leaned down, speaking in low tones that only Marcus and the court clerk could hear. Whatever she said, Marcus nodded slowly, his expression grave. 10 minutes later, Judge Hernandez's chambers were crowded in a way that violated every protocol about ex parte communication. But the judge had made an executive decision that this situation transcended standard procedure. Present in the room were Judge Hernandez, Marcus, Sarah, David, Sarah's attorney Thomas Chen, David's attorney Rebecca Kaufman, the court-appointed guardian ad litem for Emma, a woman named Patricia Rosewood who specialized in protecting children's interests, and Luna. Emma remained in the care of a bailiff in an adjacent waiting room, coloring quietly, occasionally glancing at the door where Luna had disappeared. Judge Hernandez sat behind her desk, her hands folded, her expression grave in a way that suggested she understood they were about to enter dangerous territory. "Dr. Webb, before we proceed, I want to establish something on the record. Everything said in this room regarding the minor child is being documented for the family court file. This is not off-the-record conversation. This is part of the official proceeding. Do you understand?" "I do, Your Honor," Marcus said quietly. "And you understand that what you're about to tell us may trigger a mandatory report to the Department of Children and Family Services, and potentially to law enforcement." "I understand completely." Sarah's face had gone pale. What is he talking about?" She looked at her attorney. "What's happening?" Judge Hernandez turned to Marcus. "Please explain what you whispered to Emma and why you felt it necessary to do so." Marcus took a breath. Luna, sensing his tension, pressed against his leg. He placed a hand on the dog's head, drawing strength from her presence before speaking. "During my initial intake with the family, the background interviews I conducted before today's testimony, I observed something concerning in Emma's statements that didn't match the narrative being presented by either parent," Marcus began carefully. "Emma made a comment about her father that was noteworthy. She said he was really sad, and that she heard him talking to himself in the car, talking to himself in a way that sounded like crying, according to Emma." David's attorney started to object, but Judge Hernandez held up a hand. "When I followed up on that observation," Marcus continued, "I contacted Emma's pediatrician under the authorization of both parents' attorneys. I had written consent from both of you, and inquired about whether there had been any medical documentation regarding Mr. Mitchell's mental health status." David's face had gone white. He seemed to understand where this was going. "Dr. Gonzalez informed me that approximately 14 months ago, Mr. Mitchell had been hospitalized for a psychiatric evaluation. He had attempted suicide. He was admitted to the psychiatric ward at County General Hospital and remained inpatient for 2 weeks. He was prescribed antidepressant medication and referred to intensive outpatient therapy." The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah made a sound, not a word, but a kind of choking noise that suggested she was trying to process information that contradicted everything she thought she understood about David. Her attorney put a hand on her arm. The guardian ad litem was taking notes frantically, her expression shifting from shock to analytical focus. "This is a violation of confidentiality," David's attorney said sharply, but her voice lacked conviction. She was clearly as shocked by this information as everyone else. Medical records are protected. How did? The parents authorized a full disclosure of medical and psychiatric records as part of this custody evaluation, Marcus explained. Both of you signed consent forms. I consulted with both parents' attorneys before conducting any of these interviews. Everything I did was within proper boundaries. Judge Hernandez leaned forward. Mr. Mitchell, is this accurate? Did you attempt suicide 14 months ago? David nodded, unable to speak. His hands were shaking. And you never disclosed this to your attorney? The judge asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer. She advised me not to, David finally said, his voice raw. She said it would be weaponized against me, that I'd be portrayed as unstable and dangerous around Emma, that I'd lose custody entirely. I was afraid. I'm still afraid. Rebecca Kaufman looked like she wanted to object, to distance herself from that advice, but she remained silent. The reality was that she had advised him exactly that, though not in those explicit terms. Emma sensed her father's depression, Marcus explained, addressing the entire room now. Not through words, but through his emotional absence and his erratic behavior. She internalized his suffering as her responsibility. When he didn't call, she didn't interpret it as his depression or his inability to manage his own mental health. She interpreted it as her failure to be worth calling for. Do you understand what that does to a 3-year-old's developing brain? Sarah was crying openly now, but not in anger, in horror, in the terrible realization that she'd been fighting against a man who was suffering, and in fighting, she'd forced their daughter to become his emotional caregiver. That's why I whispered to Emma, Marcus continued. I told her something that I need to say again now so it's on the record. I told her that sometimes daddies get sad, really, really sad, in a way that isn't about the people they love. It's about something broken inside themselves that needs fixing. I told her that when a daddy gets that kind of sad, it's not the child's job to fix it. And I asked her if her daddy had ever talked to her about his sad feelings, in a way that made her feel like she was supposed to help. The room seemed to stop breathing. What did she say? Judge Hernandez asked quietly. She said yes, Marcus replied. And then she said something else. She said, Daddy cries in the car. Luna, I don't know how to make Daddy happy again. Do you? Sarah made a sound like her heart was breaking. A 3-year-old, Marcus said, has appointed herself as her father's emotional caregiver. That's a reversal of care that will damage her development if it continues. Children are supposed to depend on adults for emotional regulation. They're not supposed to be responsible for managing their parents' mental health. That's a burden that causes what we call parentification, the inappropriate assignment of adult responsibilities to a child. Patricia Rosewood, the guardian ad litem, looked up from her notes. Is there any indication that this has progressed beyond emotional parentification? The question hung in the air, and everyone understood what she was actually asking. Everyone except, perhaps, David himself, who looked confused by the implications of the question. Marcus's expression became very careful. That's the concerning part, he said slowly. And that's why I needed to whisper to Emma rather than ask directly in the courtroom. He paused, and the pause itself became a kind of confession. When I whispered to Emma, asking her about how her father expressed his feelings, and whether he'd ever made her feel responsible for managing his emotions, she nodded. But then she said something else, something that made me understand the situation required immediate escalation. What did she say? Judge Hernandez asked, her voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. Marcus looked directly at David, and his expression was not unkind, but it was final. She said, Daddy touches me when he's sad. He says it makes the sad go away, but it makes my tummy feel bad. The room exploded into chaos. David stood up, his face a mask of denial. That's not, I would never. And that, Marcus said quietly, is why I whispered to her, because before I could ask anything more, before I could understand the extent of what she was describing, I needed to stop the questions. I needed to ensure that Emma's words were documented for the proper authorities, not contaminated by leading questions or additional trauma. Sarah had gone completely white. She was staring at David with an expression of such betrayal, such horror, that it seemed to physically pain her. Judge Hernandez's gavel came down with such force that it echoed through the chambers like a gunshot. "We are adjourning this proceeding immediately," she announced. "I am ordering an emergency evaluation of the minor child by trained forensic interviewers. I am contacting the district attorney's office. And Mr. Mitchell, you are to have absolutely no unsupervised contact with Emma Mitchell effective immediately. This case is now a criminal matter." And as the bailiffs began to move, as attorneys began shouting, as the machinery of criminal justice began to grind to life, Emma sat in the waiting room, coloring quietly, still waiting to see if Luna would come back, still hoping that somehow her big feelings could finally be understood. The courtroom reconvened 40 minutes later, but the atmosphere had undergone a complete metamorphosis. The carefully constructed battle lines had dissolved like salt in water. The strategic narratives that both sides had been building for 18 months were in ruins. The legal maneuvering, the character assassinations, the calculated presentations, all of it suddenly seemed trivial, almost obscene in comparison to what had just been revealed. What remained in that courtroom was raw, honest devastation. The kind of devastation that comes when two people suddenly realize they've been fighting the wrong enemy all along, that their true opponent wasn't each other, but circumstances and suffering, and the ways that damaged people damage those they claim to love. Sarah no longer looked angry at David. She looked broken with guilt, the specific, crushing guilt that comes when a protective parent realizes she has failed at the one job that matters most. She sat at her table with her hands folded on the surface, not looking at anyone, her eyes distant and hollow. David no longer looked defensive. He looked like someone who'd been drowning and had just realized the current was about to pull him under completely. His attorney sat beside him, but they weren't communicating. He seemed to be operating in a kind of shock, his lawyer's legal strategies suddenly irrelevant to whatever internal reckoning he was undergoing. Judge Hernandez addressed the room from the bench, her voice carrying the gravity of someone about to fundamentally alter the trajectory of multiple lives. "I am going to be direct about what has occurred here today. This case was originally presented to me as a custody dispute between two parents with irreconcilable differences regarding parental fit and the child's best interests. However, the reality has proven to be far more complex and infinitely more serious." She paused, letting the weight of that statement settle. "What we have discovered," Judge Hernandez continued, "is that we are no longer discussing custody arrangements and visitation schedules. We are discussing child abuse, and that requires an entirely different legal and procedural response." Sarah's hands began to shake visibly. The judge turned her attention directly to David. "Mr. Mitchell, you have been withholding material information from this court, information that is directly relevant to your fitness as a parent and your ability to provide safe, appropriate care. However, I also recognize that you sought treatment for your mental health crisis, that you have been compliant with mental health care as far as I can determine, and that you have made what appeared to be significant progress in the 14 months since your hospitalization." David couldn't meet her eyes. "That said," the judge continued, her tone hardening, "any progress you may have made in managing your own mental health is entirely irrelevant if that progress has been built on the foundation of child sexual abuse. The two cannot coexist." Then Judge Hernandez turned her attention to Sarah, and something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but becoming more complicated. "And you, Ms. Mitchell, have been operating with incomplete information, making decisions about your daughter's future based on assumptions and educated guesses rather than facts. Your protective instincts are understandable, even commendable. You were right to be concerned about your daughter's well-being during visits with her father, but your interpretation of the source of that distress was incomplete. You believed the primary issue was emotional abandonment and unreliability. You did not, could not, have known that the abuse was physical and sexual in nature. Sarah began to cry quietly, the kind of tears that came from a place so deep they seemed to originate from her bones. Emma is being harmed, Judge Hernandez said, and her voice seemed to shake slightly. Not by one parent or the other in isolation, but by the systemic failure of two adults who were so focused on their conflict with each other that they failed to see what was happening to their child. And more specifically, she is being emotionally parentified, forced into a role where she is managing her father's mental health, his emotional regulation, and apparently his sexual needs. That ends today. Immediately. Permanently. The judge outlined a new custody arrangement, nothing like what either parent had requested, nothing remotely resembling the detailed parenting plans both attorneys had been preparing. Emma would spend equal time with both parents, the judge announced, and then immediately clarified. Supervised time. All time with Mr. Mitchell will be supervised by a court-approved monitor until such time as criminal charges are resolved and a determination is made regarding his fitness as a parent. David's attorney objected, citing due process violations, but her voice was perfunctory. Everyone knew the objection was procedural theater, meaningless in the face of what had just been established. Mr. Mitchell will continue intensive therapy, Judge Hernandez continued. Not just general psychotherapy, but intensive treatment specifically addressing his depression, his suicidality, and his sexual abuse of his minor child. He will be evaluated by both a psychiatrist and a sex offender specialist. His psychiatric medications will be monitored. There will be random drug testing. The judge paused, seeming to gather herself before addressing the final conditions. Ms. Mitchell, you will enter into family counseling with your daughter, not to dredge up details or to process trauma. That will be handled by trained trauma specialists, but to help you understand your own role in the dynamics that may have enabled this abuse to continue undetected. You will work with a therapist trained in non-offending parent support to process your own guilt, your own grief, and your own need to blame yourself for failing to protect your child. Sarah nodded, tears streaming freely now. And Emma, Judge Hernandez said, her voice dropping to something barely audible, will have weekly sessions with Dr. Marcus Webb and Luna. Not as evidence, not for legal proceedings, but as part of her treatment. A trauma-informed professional who can help her understand that she is not responsible for managing her parents' emotions, that she did not cause the abuse, that she did not deserve the abuse, that she could not have prevented the abuse. Luna will help her experience what healthy emotional safety looks like, when it's not conditional on meeting an adult's needs. As the judge spoke, Emma remained in the waiting room with a court-appointed monitor, coloring quietly. Occasionally she glanced toward the door where Luna had disappeared, still holding out hope that the dog would return, still waiting to understand what happened to her big feelings. Judge Hernandez continued, I am ordering an immediate forensic evaluation of the minor child by trained interviewers from the Children's Advocacy Center. This evaluation will be conducted with appropriate safeguards to minimize additional trauma. The findings will be forwarded to the district attorney's office. And then the judge did something that would normally be considered highly unusual. She stepped down from the bench and approached David directly, speaking to him as something more than just a defendant in her court. Mr. Mitchell, I want you to understand what you have done. You have taken a child who was already struggling with anxiety and emotional dysregulation due to parental conflict. You have exploited that vulnerability. You have taught her that her body belongs to you. You have taught her that her role is to manage your emotions through physical contact. You have damaged her in ways that will take years of intensive therapy to even begin to address. David sat completely still, tears streaming down his face, but whether they were tears of remorse or tears of self-pity, it was difficult to tell. And the truly tragic part, the judge continued, is that you appear to be a man who desperately needed mental health treatment. You were suicidal. You were depressed. Those conditions are treatable. But instead of accepting help and moving forward with your recovery, you victimized your own child. You transferred your pain directly into her body. Judge Hernandez returned to her bench. This court is now in recess pending the forensic evaluation of the minor child and the involvement of the district attorney's office. All custody arrangements are suspended pending that evaluation. Mr. Mitchell, you are remanded into the custody of the bailiff. You will not have contact with your daughter. You will not attempt to communicate with Ms. Mitchell. You will not attempt to influence or intimidate any witnesses. Is that understood? Yes, Your Honor, David said, his voice barely audible. As the bailiffs began to move toward him, as the machinery of criminal justice began its slow, grinding activation, Sarah sat frozen at her table. The victory she had sought, the court's acknowledgement that David was an unfit parent, tasted like ashes in her mouth. Because the victory came at the cost of her daughter's safety having been violated in ways she couldn't protect her from, in ways that would haunt both of them for decades. One of the bailiffs approached David to place him in restraints. As they did, David looked across the courtroom toward the door where Emma was waiting, and something in his expression, a mixture of grief and desperation, and the dawning recognition of what he'd done, suggested that whatever recovery he had achieved in the past 14 months was about to be obliterated by the reality of criminal consequences. But the moment that would stick with everyone in that courtroom came when the door to the judge's chambers opened, and Emma, still holding her stuffed dog, still waiting for Luna to return, caught sight of her father being led away in handcuffs. "Daddy," she called out confused, her small voice cutting through all the legal formality. "Daddy, where are you going? Can Luna come too?" And in that moment, Sarah finally understood the full scope of the damage. Her daughter didn't understand why her father was being taken away. She didn't understand that the man she loved had hurt her. She didn't understand that the confusion in her body, the fear she couldn't name, the inappropriate sexual contact she'd been taught to accept as love, it all came from him. Sarah stood up and moved toward her daughter, sweeping her into her arms, and began to cry in a way that suggested she might never stop. The next 24 hours were a blur of trauma protocol that nobody who lived through it would ever fully process or completely forget. Emma was taken from the courtroom not by her mother, but by a trained victim advocate from the county's Department of Child Protective Services. The separation was necessary. The law required it. And yet watching Sarah's face as her daughter was led away by a stranger represented a second trauma layered on top of the first. Sarah had to trust that the system designed to protect children would actually do so. She had to accept that her instinct to hold her daughter and never let go had to be subordinated to the legal machinery that required careful documentation and professional evaluation. Emma was transported to a specialized children's advocacy center located in a different county, a place deliberately designed to look like a comfortable home rather than an interrogation room. Soft lighting, comfortable furniture, toys arranged with the kind of casual abundance that suggested play was as important as anything else that might happen there. The center was staffed by forensic interviewers trained specifically in the delicate work of documenting child sexual abuse without re-traumatizing the victim or contaminating the legal evidence. And Emma had specifically requested that Luna be present. Judge Hernandez had authorized it, an unusual decision that bent protocol, but one that was justified by the understanding that Luna's presence would help Emma feel safe enough to speak. So on the afternoon after the courtroom revelation, Emma sat in a small room with pale yellow walls and a therapist named Dr. Rebecca Acaffer, and Luna lay across her small lap, grounding her with the dog's warm weight. The interviews were conducted carefully, professionally, and with a kind of gentleness that contrasted sharply with the severity of what was being discussed. "Emma," Dr. Acaffer began, her voice warm and non-leading, I want you to know that this is a safe place. You can say anything you want. There are no wrong answers, and Luna is here to help you feel brave. Does that sound okay?" Emma nodded, her small hand buried in Luna's fur. "Can you tell me about your daddy?" Dr. Acaffer asked, the question so open-ended that it gave Emma complete control over what she revealed. And over the course of 3 hours, with breaks for water and bathroom visits and moments, when Emma just needed to be held by a dog who asked nothing of her, the full scope of the abuse emerged. The abuse had been ongoing for at least 8 months. It had started innocuously, as abuse always does, with physical affection that gradually crossed boundaries, a hug that lasted too long, a hand placed in an inappropriate location under the guise of playfulness, kisses that became increasingly sexual. The progression was deliberate, methodical grooming. David had used specific language designed to normalize the abuse and ensure Emma's silence. He had told her that what they were doing was their special secret, that it was how daddies show love, that it was what grown-ups do when they love each other very much. And most devastatingly, he had told her that mommy wouldn't understand, so you can't tell her because it will make her sad and it will be your fault. Emma had internalized a horrifying equation over those 8 months. Her father's needs came before her safety. Her role was to manage his emotions and his sexual desires. Her silence was a form of love. Her discomfort was something she should endure because speaking up would hurt her mother. The forensic interview revealed something else too, something that made Marcus's earlier assessment look like he had only been scratching the surface of a much deeper problem. When asked about her father's emotional state, Emma described episodes where David would cry intensely, would talk about wanting to go away and never come back, and would then turn to Emma for physical comfort that quickly escalated into sexual abuse. The pattern was clear to every professional observing the interview. David had been using his daughter as a form of emotional regulation and sexual gratification. When his depression overwhelmed him, when his suicidal ideation became acute, when he felt desperate and alone, he would turn to his 3-year-old daughter to manage his internal state. And when that emotional management wasn't enough, he would escalate to sexual abuse. The abuse wasn't about sexuality in the way that might be understood in an adult context. It was about power, control, the ability to access comfort from someone who couldn't refuse him, couldn't report him, couldn't establish boundaries. A 3-year-old was the perfect victim for a man whose mental illness and sexual pathology had converged into a catastrophic violation of the most fundamental trust. In her own interview room, Sarah was being questioned by a detective and a victim advocate. She was being asked the impossible questions. Had she noticed anything? Had there been warning signs she'd missed? Could she forgive herself for not protecting her daughter sooner? The weight of maternal guilt was crushing her alive. She replayed every moment, every interaction, every time Emma had seemed withdrawn or anxious or clingy. She castigated herself for not recognizing the signs. She raged at herself for being so focused on David's emotional abandonment that she had failed to see the sexual abuse happening right under her nose. But the victim advocate, a woman named Patricia who had worked in this field for 15 years, kept returning to the same message. "Sarah, you did not fail your daughter. The person who failed her is her father. You are not responsible for his choices." And yet Sarah couldn't accept that absolution, because mothers were supposed to protect their children. That was the covenant. That was the promise written into every cell of her body, and she had failed. Midway through the interview, a detective entered with a grave expression. Sarah's heart began to race. "Ms. Mitchell," the detective said carefully, "I need to ask you some additional questions. Has your daughter ever been alone with any other adults? Have there been any other concerns about her behavior around other men?" Sarah's blood went cold. "My boyfriend," she whispered, "Mark, he's been at my house most nights for the past 3 months. Emma was acting strange around him too. I told myself it was just adjustment anxiety. She's had so much upheaval with the custody battles. But now, she couldn't finish the sentence. The implication was too horrifying. The detective and victim advocate exchanged a glance. Within hours, Mark was being investigated as well. Sarah's home was being searched. Her text messages with Mark were being reviewed. A completely separate investigation was being opened. Because what the professionals understood, what the system had learned from decades of child abuse cases, was that children who had been groomed to accept abuse from one authority figure became vulnerable to manipulation by anyone with predatory inclinations. Emma had been taught that her body belonged to adults, that her discomfort should be managed silently, that her role was to meet other people's emotional and physical needs. A predator could see that a mile away. Sarah spent hours in that interview room, not being interrogated, but being questioned about every interaction Mark had had with Emma. Had he ever asked to babysit alone? Had he ever shown unusual interest in Emma's body? Had he ever given her gifts? Had he ever told her to keep secrets? The answer to most of these questions was no. Mark appeared to be innocent of any sexual interest in Emma. But the fact that the investigation had to happen, the fact that Sarah's judgment had to be questioned, the fact that Emma's vulnerability had been exposed to potential revictimization, it all added another layer of trauma to what was already an unbearable situation. That night, as Emma slept fitfully in a safe house with a court-appointed guardian ad litem, Marcus sat with the child during one of her nightmares. The girl woke up screaming, her small body drenched in sweat, her eyes wild with terror. Luna was already there. The dog seemed to sense the moment before Emma fully woke, pressing against the child's side, offering her weight and her heartbeat and her unconditional presence. Marcus didn't try to comfort her with words. Words were useless in the face of trauma this acute. Instead, he simply remained present, letting Luna do what Luna was trained to do, anchor a fractured child to the physical reality of being safe, of being held, of being protected. "Will Daddy get a timeout?" Emma asked in the darkness, her 3-year-old mind trying desperately to make sense of something that had no logical sense, that violated every expectation she had about how the world worked, that couldn't be integrated into any framework a child possessed. Marcus's response was honest in a way that would define the entire next phase of Emma's healing. He didn't offer false reassurance. He didn't minimize what had happened. He didn't try to wrap the trauma in comforting narratives. "Your dad did something very wrong," Marcus said quietly. "And yes, he will be held accountable. He will go to court. He will likely go to jail. He will have to answer for what he did." Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing this information in whatever way a traumatized 3-year-old could. Then she asked something that made Marcus understand how deep the damage went, how thoroughly her father had rewired her understanding of her own role and responsibility. "But if he goes to jail, who will I be responsible for making happy?" And in that question, in that heartbreaking, devastating revelation, Marcus understood that the work ahead would be far more complex than simply processing the abuse. Emma had been taught that her purpose was to manage other people's emotions. She had been taught that she was responsible for her father's happiness, his emotional regulation, his sexual satisfaction. And now she was terrified that if he was removed from her life, she would have failed at the one job that had been assigned to her since birth. The real healing, Marcus understood, would require teaching a damaged child that she had no responsibility for anyone's happiness but her own, that her body belonged to her alone, that she could say no, that she could be selfish, that she could survive without managing anyone else's emotional needs. And that was a lesson that would take years to learn. 6 months later, the criminal case came to trial in a courtroom 3 counties away from where the initial custody hearing had taken place. The change of venue was strategic. Judge Hernandez had recognized that the publicity surrounding the case had made a fair trial in the original county nearly impossible. The story had spread beyond local news into national coverage. Articles about the K-9 case that had uncovered child sexual abuse appeared in major publications. Long-form journalism pieces dissected the failures of the custody system to recognize signs of abuse. Interviews with Marcus about trauma-informed justice and the ways children encode their pain into their bodies appeared on podcasts and news programs. Documentary filmmakers circled, sensing a story that could win awards and change policy. But in the small, quiet spaces, the ones where real healing actually happens, the story was much simpler and infinitely more complex. Emma still had panic attacks. They came without warning, triggered by sounds that reminded her of her father's voice, by the smell of cologne, by the sight of a man with his particular build. She still struggled with sleep. Some nights she would wake up screaming from nightmares she couldn't articulate. Other nights she would simply lie awake, her small body rigid with anxiety, unable to quiet her mind enough to rest. She still sometimes thought that her job was to manage other people's emotions. When her mother came home from work looking tired, Emma would try to make her laugh, would perform elaborate dances or tell stories with an intensity that suggested she was trying to fix her mother's mood. When Marcus arrived for therapy sessions, Emma would immediately assess his emotional state. Was he happy? Sad? Angry? And would adjust her own behavior accordingly, trying to be the kind of patient who didn't require too much, who was easy, who didn't add to anyone's burden. But she was in therapy, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, delivered twice a week by a specialist trained in childhood sexual abuse. The therapist, Dr. James Martinez, was patient and skilled, and he understood that healing from abuse this severe wasn't linear. There would be good weeks and terrible weeks. There would be moments of progress followed by setbacks that seemed to erase everything that had been accomplished. Sarah had also entered therapy, not just for Emma's sake, but for her own. A trauma-informed therapist who specialized in non-offending parents helped her process the cascade of guilt, grief, and rage that threatened to consume her. Sarah had to learn to separate her responsibility from her daughter's pain. She had to understand that she had done the best she could with the information she had. She had to accept that protective mothers sometimes fail not because they are bad mothers, but because abusers are often skilled at concealment. And 3 times a week, Emma would sit with Luna and Dr. Marcus Webb in a small office decorated with soft colors and therapeutic toys. Luna's presence was not magical. It didn't erase trauma. It didn't make the pain disappear or the memories fade. But it created a space where a child could learn that not all affection came with strings attached, where a body's safety was respected, where silence wasn't required to protect someone else's emotional state, where the simple act of being held, the dog's weight on her lap, her arms around the dog's neck, could teach her something that her father had tried to destroy. That comfort existed without cost. On the first day of trial, David pleaded guilty. His attorney had advised him to fight the charges, to claim that Emma had been coached, that Sarah had weaponized the child, that the forensic interviews had been contaminated. But standing in the courtroom, looking at the photographs of his daughter's small body marked with bruises and abrasions, something in David seemed to break, or perhaps to finally admit what he had always known. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of child sexual abuse and 1 count of grooming. The plea agreement meant that Emma would not have to testify. She would not have to sit in a witness box and describe what her father had done to her while he sat across the room, watching her, potentially trying to send her messages of apology or manipulation or threats. She would not have to relive her trauma in a courtroom while lawyers tried to poke holes in her narrative or suggest that she was lying or confused or had been coached by her mother. It was a mercy, though mercy seemed like a hollow word for what it was. A mercy is something graceful, something kind. What it really represented was the avoidance of additional trauma. The sentencing phase came 2 weeks later. The judge in this case, Judge Robert Morrison, a man in his 60s with decades of experience presiding over criminal cases, listened to victim impact statements from Sarah and from Dr. Marcus Webb. He reviewed psychological evaluations that documented the extent of Emma's trauma. He considered David's own mental health history, his depression, his previous suicide attempt, his claims of remorse. And then he issued a sentence, 17 years in prison, with the requirement that David complete specialized sex offender treatment while incarcerated. He would be required to register as a sex offender for the rest of his life. He would never have unsupervised contact with any minor children. The possibility of parole would be considered only after he had completed at least 12 years of his sentence. David showed no reaction as the sentence was read. He simply nodded, as if he had expected this outcome, as if some part of him understood that this was the price of what he had done. In the gallery, Sarah sat with her hands folded, and while she didn't smile, something in her expression suggested a kind of resolution. Not happiness. How could there be happiness in a situation where her daughter had been sexually abused by her biological father? But perhaps the beginning of the ability to move forward. After the sentencing in the hallway outside the courtroom, a reporter approached Sarah with a camera crew and microphone. "Ms. Mitchell, how do you feel about the sentence?" Sarah looked directly at the camera, and her response was measured but firm. "My daughter was hurt by someone she trusted completely. 17 years is not too long. It's not enough, but it's something. And now maybe she can begin to heal without being afraid that her father will find a way to hurt her again." That night, Emma sat with Luna in her bedroom, and Sarah read her a bedtime story. Not about princesses or magical adventures, but about a small girl whose dog helped her understand that she was brave and strong and worthy of protection. "Is that story about me?" Emma asked, her eyes already drooping with sleep. "Yes, baby," Sarah said. "It's about you, about your strength, about how you were brave enough to tell the truth even though you were scared." Emma nodded and closed her eyes, and for the first time in months, she slept through the entire night without waking up in terror. But the work of healing was far from over. In fact, in many ways, it was only beginning. Because processing trauma doesn't follow a linear timeline. The brain of a child who has been sexually abused rewires itself in ways that take years to understand and address. Emma would have good weeks where she seemed to be progressing, where she could talk about her feelings without completely shutting down, where she could be held without flinching away. And then something, a song on the radio, the sound of a man's voice, the smell of a particular cologne, would trigger her nervous system, and she would regress, would become clingy and withdrawn and anxious again. Sarah learned to hold space for these regressions without taking them personally. She learned that healing wasn't about getting back to normal. There was no normal to get back to. Instead, healing was about building a new normal, one that incorporated the trauma but wasn't defined by it. Marcus continued to see Emma 3 times a week. In their sessions, he worked on helping her develop emotional regulation skills, teaching her techniques to calm her nervous system when panic arose. He helped her practice saying no to adults, helped her understand that her body belonged to her, that she had the right to set boundaries, that protecting herself wasn't selfish or mean. And Luna remained constant. The dog didn't judge Emma for her bad days. She didn't try to fix her or make her feel better. She simply lay beside her, offering her presence, her heartbeat, her unconditional acceptance. 6 months into the therapy process, during what had become routine sessions, Emma did something that made Marcus understand how far she had come and how far she still had to go. She drew a picture. It showed a small girl, a big dog, and what appeared to be a sunshine breaking through dark clouds. But unlike previous drawings where the girl looked small and sad, in this drawing the girl was standing tall. Her arms were raised. Her face showed something that might have been joy, or at least the beginning of joy. "What is this, Emma?" Marcus asked gently, the same question he had asked about dozens of her previous drawings. "That's me," Emma pointed to the small figure. "That's Luna, and that's what happy feels like now. Marcus wrote it down in his clinical notes, but what he wrote wasn't clinical at all. He wrote, "That's scared happy. Emma's term. The most accurate description of trauma recovery I have ever encountered." 18 months after David's sentencing, Judge Patricia Hernandez received a written request that made her pause in a way few things did anymore. Emma Mitchell, now 4.5 years old, wanted to visit the courtroom where everything had changed. She wanted to thank the judge who had protected her. She wanted to understand, in whatever way a young child could, what had happened to her and why. It was an unusual request, and technically it violated several protocols. Victims of child sexual abuse were generally kept away from courtroom environments as much as possible. Revisiting the site of legal proceedings could trigger traumatic memories. The involvement of a judge in a victim's healing process could be seen as inappropriate, a blurring of professional boundaries. But Judge Hernandez had taken such a personal interest in Emma's case that she agreed. She arranged for the hearing to take place on a Saturday morning when the courthouse was quiet, when there would be no media presence, when the space could be transformed from a formal legal arena into something smaller, more intimate, more human. Present in the empty courtroom were Judge Hernandez, Emma, her mother Sarah, Dr. Marcus Webb, Luna, and a court-appointed victim advocate who was there to ensure that Emma's emotional safety remained the priority. Emma actually stood, with her feet on the floor, no longer needing to be held, and looked up at the judge who had protected her when everyone else had failed. "I wanted to say thank you," Emma said, her voice small but steady, carrying the kind of courage that comes from having survived something that should have broken her. "For believing me, and for making the bad man stop." Judge Hernandez stepped down from the bench, a violation of courtroom protocol that would have been unthinkable in any other circumstance, but which seemed necessary in this moment. She knelt down to Emma's level, her judicial robes pooling around her on the courtroom floor. "Emma, you're the one who was brave enough to tell the truth," the judge said, and her voice carried genuine emotion. "I just listened. But I want you to know something that's very important. You are going to grow up and you're going to be okay. It will take time. It will be hard. There will be days when you feel sad or scared or angry, but you're stronger than what happened to you. Do you understand that?" Emma nodded seriously, then asked a question that made everyone in the courtroom understand how far she still had to go, and simultaneously how much progress she had made. "But what if I'm like my daddy?" Emma asked, her small voice carrying a fear that had clearly been living in her for some time. "What if the bad thing is inside me too? What if when I grow up I hurt people like he did?" The question hung in the courtroom like a prayer spoken in darkness. Sarah made a sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a sob, and moved as if to pull her daughter into her arms. But Marcus gently held up a hand. This was Emma's moment to be heard, to have her fear acknowledged and addressed by an adult she trusted. Judge Hernandez met Emma's eyes directly. "Emma, that's a very important question and I'm glad you asked it, but I need you to understand something. The fact that you're worried about hurting people means you have a conscience. It means you care about others. Your daddy didn't worry about that. He didn't care if he hurt you, and that's the difference between him and you." Emma listened, but it was clear from her expression that the fear was still there, still rooted deep in her psyche. "Your body remembers what happened to you," Judge Hernandez continued, speaking with the kind of clarity that only comes from someone who has spent years working with trauma survivors. "And sometimes that makes you feel scared or confused or ashamed. But those feelings don't mean the bad thing is inside you. They mean the bad thing was done to you. And that's very different." Marcus stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Emma's shoulder. "Emma, I want to tell you something about Luna," he said quietly. "Luna is a dog. She has instincts, she has a nature, she has things that are just part of who she is. But she was trained to be good and kind. Humans are the same way. You can choose to be kind. You will get to choose that every single day for the rest of your life. And I believe you're going to choose kindness because you've already shown me that's who you are." Emma reached down and put her hand on Luna's head. The dog pressed her warmth against the child's legs, offering the kind of unconditional presence that had become the foundation of Emma's healing. "Okay," Emma said simply, and something in her voice suggested that she had taken in the message, or at least the beginning of it. "I choose Luna's way." Over the following months, something shifted in Emma's healing trajectory. She still had bad days. She still experienced moments when her nervous system would dysregulate, when sounds or smells or the sight of a particular type of person would trigger her trauma responses. But increasingly, those moments were becoming exceptions rather than the rule. She was beginning to build a sense of identity that wasn't defined by what had been done to her. In therapy with Dr. Martinez, Emma worked on processing the abuse through play and art and talk. She created what the therapist called a feelings vocabulary, words to describe the wide range of emotions that lived in her body. She learned that anger wasn't bad, that sadness was okay, that fear could be managed. She practiced setting boundaries with her mother, saying no when she didn't want to be touched, saying yes when she wanted comfort. With Marcus and Luna, she engaged in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy designed specifically for children who had experienced sexual abuse. They worked on cognitive distortions, the false beliefs Emma had internalized about herself, that she was broken, that she was responsible for her father's behavior, that she deserved what had happened to her, that her body was not her own. Slowly, painstakingly, Emma began to develop new neural pathways that contradicted these beliefs, not through words alone, but through the daily experience of having her body respected, her boundaries honored, her autonomy supported. Sarah, meanwhile, had undergone her own transformation. She had been in therapy processing the guilt and trauma of having failed to protect her daughter. She had learned about the psychology of grooming and how abusers deliberately operate in ways designed to avoid detection. She had come to understand that she was not a bad mother, that even good, attentive, protective mothers sometimes failed to see abuse because abusers were skilled at concealment. She had also learned to recognize the ways that her own childhood trauma had made her vulnerable to certain dynamics in her relationship with David. A therapist had helped her understand that she had chosen a man with untreated mental illness, had unconsciously assigned herself the role of emotional caregiver, and had then been shocked when he transferred that dynamic onto their daughter. The work of healing wasn't just about Emma. It was about breaking cycles that had been operating across generations, transforming patterns that had been passed down through trauma and neglect, and the failure of adults to address their own psychological damage. 1 year after the sentencing, Sarah made the decision to return to work full-time. It was a milestone, returning to something approaching a normal life, building financial independence, creating structure and purpose beyond her role as a protective mother. She found a job as a medical administrator, work that was steady and meaningful, and allowed her to provide for herself and Emma without relying on anyone else. Emma started preschool. It was terrifying. Sarah had genuine concerns about how Emma would manage in a group setting, whether she would be triggered by other children, whether she would be able to regulate her emotions in an environment where Marcus and Luna couldn't be present. But Emma surprised everyone. She was quiet, she was careful, she observed before she participated, but she was also resilient. She made friends. She learned to play. She participated in circle time and art projects and outdoor activities. She was building a life that extended beyond trauma. 2 years after the trial, during what had become a routine therapy session, Emma did something that made Marcus understand that the work they had done together had fundamentally transformed her relationship with herself. She was drawing as she often did, but this time the drawing was different. It showed a girl, older than Emma was now, maybe 7 or 8, standing in front of a mirror. The girl in the mirror was smiling. "What is this, Emma?" Marcus asked, recognizing that something significant had shifted. "That's me when I'm bigger," Emma said matter-of-factly. "I'm looking at myself in the mirror and I'm happy, and I'm not scared of what I see." Marcus wrote in his notes, "Significant therapeutic milestone. Emma is beginning to develop a future-oriented identity separate from her trauma. She is imagining herself as a person who can be happy, who doesn't have to be defined by what happened to her." But the real transformation came during a conversation that happened organically, without therapeutic prompting. Emma was sitting with Luna, her small hand buried in the dog's fur, when she said something that made Sarah, who was sitting nearby, begin to cry. "I think I want to be a doctor like Dr. Martinez when I grow up," Emma said. "Or maybe work with dogs like Luna. I want to help kids who are scared, because I know what scared feels like, and I know that if you have a dog and a nice person, it gets better." And in that moment, in Emma's articulation of a future that included purpose and meaning, and the desire to help others who had suffered, everyone in that room understood that healing was possible. Not the kind of healing that erased what had happened, but the kind that transformed trauma into wisdom, that converted pain into compassion, that allowed a damaged child to become a resilient human being capable of offering others what had been offered to her: presence, acceptance, and the belief that even after terrible things, life could still hold meaning. As the small girl walked out of the office holding her mother's hand and Luna's leash, everyone who had been involved in this case, from the judge to the prosecutors to the victim advocates to Marcus himself, understood something fundamental. This was not the end of Emma's story. This was only the beginning. The real work of healing a child who had learned that her body belonged to others, that her silence was love, that her role was to manage someone else's chaos, that work would take years, maybe a lifetime. But for the first time since this courtroom drama had begun, there was something that hadn't existed before in Emma's world. Not just hope, but the concrete belief that she could become someone who used her own survival to help others survive. And it had all arrived on 4 paws, in the form of a dog who asked for nothing, but to sit beside a broken child and simply be present, while she learned to break free from the chains that had been placed on her since birth. The dog, Luna, had taught Emma the most important lesson of all, that healing is not about becoming someone different. It's about becoming fully yourself. And that sometimes, the greatest gift one being can offer another is not advice or solutions, but simply the willingness to sit in the darkness and wait until the light comes.